So excited to be here. I was excited when Autumn had reached out to me about speaking. I hadn't been out to this part of Maryland before, but I love camping and hikes. My kind of camping, though, is like in a nice, controlled cabin, not necessarily like the tent with like the bear, like being able to get me. So let me add that caveat in there. So my husband and my little son, 17 months, they joined me. So we're definitely looking forward to checking things out after the conference. But the topic for today will be about the time between awareness and change. And so I realized as I was just reading the title now that, we have like tech at the gap, and it's like Rocky Gap. So I have described a gap, and I didn't even realize that with the title. So, but there is a time between. So I'm looking forward to certainly having this discussion with you all. I want it to be interactive and interesting. I am right before lunch, and if you all are like me, I'm a foodie. So I'm going to try to be very time sensitive, but definitely feel free to ask questions, and I'll be hanging around afterwards just in case. Don't want to be the one impeding you from your food. So. All right, so just my military dad always indicated that you should tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So I at least get the first two parts right. I will give you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell you. I'm not always the best at recapping, so sorry, Dad, in advance, but at least I got 2 of 3. So we already did the speaker introduction, so we'll be flying by that slide pretty quickly. We're going to talk a bit about security breaches and just kind of digging into those and why they're such a problem and how much they cost, kind of quantifying the problem. We're going to go into some common security patch and configuration testing approaches. The key part is being the testing part. So I'll get into that a bit later as to why that's the emphasis and point of this discussion. Some recommendations, resources, especially free. The other thing about me is I like free, even though we heard this morning nothing is ever free because we're the product, but it is what it is, at least not dollars coming out of our pocket right then, right? And then we'll have some Q&A, and I'll leave my contact information. But again, feel free, raise your hand if I say something in the middle of the presentation. I'm happy to entertain that, but I will repeat it back, I believe, just so the recording is clear, okay? All right, so we already went over me. So where we want to focus is on just where this problem is when we talk about the time between awareness and actually making a change. So what's happening is that a lot of organizations are taking way too long to make the security updates, even when they know what the problem is. So when you think about all the tools that can be used, like vulnerability scanners, those can tell you whether or not you have a patch that needs to be applied to your system. You have configuration scanners, which can tell you if you're trying to comply with a certain benchmark or industry standard. From a security perspective, you can use that in an automated fashion to scan your computer system. It'll come back and say, hey, here's some changes that you need to make. Some common ones are CIS benchmarks, so Center for Internet Security benchmarks. They have configuration scanning tools for multiple technologies, or DISA STIGs. That's a Defense Information Security Agency, a government agency, and the STIGs is just security, technology implementation guide. I think I got the acronym right. But those are standards that you can look at, and they'll tell you, hey, so changes that you might need to make is your password complexity needs a little help, right? So that could be a particular configuration standard. You make it too easy, so you should require users to enter more complex passwords. Or you have a guest account that's still enabled on your system. That makes it too easy for someone to get into your computer if they look for the guest account. So these are configuration settings, et cetera, examples. And so organizations, they know about the problems when they do the scanner, so they find them, or they see that there's some 0-day email or newspaper posting that comes out about some 0-day attack or threat. You would think that organizations would be like, oh, security issue? Immediately, I'm going to make this change. The problem is that making those changes sometimes can break things, and we'll get into that a little bit more, right? So organizations get really hesitant because they're like, well, on the one hand, I could get breached. that's a problem. On the other hand, if I make the security update and something goes down and the security breaks like my main program used to provide service to customers, no good, right? Like, so they're kind of sitting in that place. But when they sit in that place and wait too long, that's where 80% of security breaches. So when you're reading about ransomware attacks or like a breach of like some passwords or, think of your myriad of attacks, in 80% of those cases, it's because an organization did not make an appropriate security update, patch, or configuration. They sat on it too long. And it's costing $4.2 million per breach per organization. So that's really costly. And a lot of small businesses just don't survive that, right? Like maybe some large organizations could absorb some of the cost and still survive, but a lot of small businesses that incur this kind of breach, they just end up going out of business. They simply can't afford it. So there's current approaches as to the way that organizations would make changes. One of the ways is just spray and pray, right? Some organizations are like, look, we just don't want to be like a partner of an account I used to work for. Like my boss, he said, Tina, just keep me off the cover of USA Today. That was like, if you wanted my job description in a nutshell, like that was my job description, right? And so in that case, like there was very little tolerance for any sort of headline around a breach. And some organizations are that way to the extent that even if something breaks functionally, just like where they are organizationally, they would rather afford that break in functionality than to have a headline around a security breach. And so some organizations will just spray and pray, like push the security update and hope for the best, right? Other ones, they will do a limited deployment to their production environment. So imagine an organization has thousands of systems in their organization. And so what the organization will say, okay, well, we don't want to push this security update to everybody yet, but we will choose like a subset in production. So maybe we'll choose 10 representative systems. Like we have 10 different variations of systems in our environment, so we'll choose 10. We'll deploy the security update there, and then we'll let users just use the system the way they normally would on those 10 systems for maybe like a week or 2 or 3. The problem with that is if anything wonky does happen, then the user reports it. They're not really in a good position to tell you what they were doing when something broke, right? Like, so if you're trying to use that as your testing, it's really difficult to recreate what a user was doing when that security update like yielded some broken functionality. And so organizations that try to stay on a schedule and say, hey, we're going to make updates every 7 days or every 14 days, inevitably, and I've seen this, we had a project with one of my companies that we were responsible for helping this large multinational company help their suppliers come up to a certain security code or benchmark, right? And so the thing is, they were using this limited deployment to production approach. So what ended up happening is we were supposed to help them get to 100% compliance. So in a set time. The thing is, they would say, oh, well, we were going to make that change, but then when something broke, like the user said something wonky happened, so we can't deploy that change now on schedule. Like we need to go back and figure out what happened, and then we need to retest it. So it was just like week after week, came to month after month that they had no clarity on whether or not they could deploy that security update broadly to the organization. And us being in the position of managing, obviously that wasn't going very well, right? We weren't keeping them on any kind of schedule. The last approach is like to do a test environment and manual testing, right? Like, so you could have like a test environment that looks like your production environment. You could stand that up. You could deploy the changes to that like replica environment, and then you could test out the changes and see if anything breaks there before you deploy to production. The problem with that is that also takes time. It's really difficult to maintain an actual copy of your system or environment like in real time. Things change often in like production that's not reflected in testing, and so it's not like exactly like one for one, right? And this kind of testing, typically for those, heads up, going into like this cyber kind of profession, there are 600,000 open cyber jobs in the US. And so like anyone that gets tapped to say, hey, like, can you stay after work at 11 p.m. or on the weekend to do this testing so that we know whether it breaks or not before we roll it out to production? That's typically the time and the request that comes in, right? Like, that's like not the best quality of life, like, because who's really paying that much attention and that passionate about finding functional issues when you're having to work from 11 p.m., you know, on and after hours, or work on the weekend? Like, maybe once, but that gets old, like, you know, after the first time. So that's the other, you know, kind of status quo in terms of the way things are working with testing these issues before deploying them. So, as I mentioned, with the problem of breaches, it gets exacerbated. I mentioned the open cyber jobs. CyberSeek is like a really good website. They keep track of this, so you can see like all the open positions across the U.S., the titles of them, where they're located geographically, and the number of openings. So that's where I'm getting like this figure. So cyber workforce, you all are coming into like a field that has like negative unemployment, right? So it's a great opportunity, but certainly the demand is outpacing the supply. So stay the course, stay the course. Also complicating the problem is the increasing compliance requirements. So cybersecurity is, I don't know if you all, you know, whichever sessions you went to, whether it's the cyber session you went to with CMMC or the metaverse with innovation, one of the things that came up is, of course, cybersecurity. You're not going to avoid cyber in any capacity. And increasingly, these industries that have financial data, health data, education data, et cetera, are needing to ensure that there's a certain amount of cybersecurity incorporated, including like IoT. We think it's dangerous now, like when we think of like data compromise, but when you consider like Internet of Things, especially, you know, medical devices or cars, there is the impact for loss is like human life, right? Human wellness. And that's the challenge, and why there was legislation from 2001 that requires for any IoT used in federal government systems that they have certain security requirements included within them and designed within them. So NIST, National Institute of Standard and Technology, was tasked with the responsibility of coming up with what those like minimum security settings and configurations need to be for IoT, because IoT isn't just going to be loss of data. Depending upon how that IoT is used and where, that has implications on human life and wellness as well. So cybersecurity becomes really a safety issue. So when we look at some of the top security breaches in the news, how many of you read about or heard about any of these breaches listed here? Yeah, hands raised, yeah. So these are, I mean, this is a smattering of breaches that have happened, right? Like some of the most expensive, but that $4.2 million average that I mentioned, you of course see that average gets like weighted and tilted like, you know, on the higher end when you're looking at some of these more expensive ones, right? Like, so 4.2 is definitely, you know, like on the lower end of what's possible in terms of breaches. And so, you know, some of these organizations are in a better position, you know, obviously maybe to absorb some of that, but still I'm quite sure, like, you know, stock prices and shareholders were not happy when you have this kind of loss. And when you're looking at like the cost of a breach, some of the considerations that you have are not just like the actual technology recovery part of it, but think about the reputation recovery, right? Like how much marketing and media and public relations might you have to do, or if it's loss of individuals or consumers' data. How many of you have gotten like an email saying, hey, our database was breached and now we're giving you free credit monitoring services for a year or 2 years or whatever. So that's a cost like to the company. So when we're looking at these costs, there's a lot that goes into saying like what the cost of a breach is, and it's not just the technology, right? Like, so this is what's at play or what's possible with organizations that aren't making timely updates to their systems. It's so so mundane, and so much of cyber, like some of the cool kind of topics are like threat hunting, right? Like everybody likes this notion of like threat hunting and, like chasing down the hacker. And, you're not going to find a movie about like patching. You're not going to find a movie about like functional testing to determine the impact of a security update, right? Like it's not going to be, like that's not going to be like your thrill title. I don't even know even if you put that in the metaverse with like AR and VR, that there would be much, right? There might be some chip crunching that you would hear and, just somebody like up late doing something. But, the unfortunate part of that, though, is that because we're not taking good care of like the mundane aspects of like, testing patches before they're deployed, or like making updates in a timely manner, et cetera, it's costing not just companies, but this has implications, right? Like sometimes jobs or even like businesses, as I indicated, especially small businesses, they're just not in a position to be able to absorb this kind of financial loss. All right, so when we think about doing some of our testing, some of it I already mentioned, but even in coming to determining what those issues are in the first place. So vulnerability and configuration scanning. You can do that during work hours, of course. Like I said, those responsible for doing the scanning would certainly prefer it to be done during work hours than after hours, right? Like that way they can just stay with their 9 to 5. So it's a benefit to those doing the testing, but it's a higher likelihood of adversely impacting operations. So just as like a story, I was security manager for this software development team, and so we had the responsibility of doing the scanning. So we configured the scan tool, and unfortunately, something was not quite right in the scan tool configuration. Like I asked my team member about it, and it was not set. Like you can configure like vulnerability scan tools with like different settings, and one of the settings is to actually try to take advantage of or exploit like a vulnerability that's found. So like in this case, it was around like passwords and accounts. So the setting was that, okay, if we find accounts that have weak passwords, should we try to get into or access that account? And so that setting should have been no. But turns out it was set to yes, apparently, because when we ran the scan, it did a brute force. And brute force meaning it just tried to go through and guess like the password, the easy password of those accounts. And the configuration setting on the system is that after 3 failed attempts, then the account should lock. So it locked everybody's account on the system. And that was a problem. And the only way we got back in, like it was such a bad day for the security team. The only way we got back in is due to a developer who had created a backdoor which was against the security policy. And we had to use the backdoor to get back in, to reset everyone's account. Like I was just like, epic fail. Like it was.
Developer reprimanded?
Yeah. Well, it was kind of like you bad, that. Yeah, like it was like. So can you use that? Unlock everybody's account? Yeah. Yeah, so it got really interesting in that regard. And the sad thing is, it's just like, security gets and got blamed, and it continues as a pattern, right? Like for breaking stuff, right? It's just like, you security people, you slow stuff down and you break stuff. Like, geez, like, So that day it was just like, oh, geez, like, I had to talk to my team. I was like, I cannot stress enough that we are already under a microscope. But I bring that up just as an example, like security break stuff. That's the danger of doing like testing, be it security testing or functional testing in a production environment. Like stuff breaks. Like ideally, we would have had a test environment where we could run the vulnerability scans and see what the impact or what the results were from that scan, and then be able to make fixes from there, right? So during the after hours, of course, you have time to recover. In this particular case, it wasn't time. The setting wasn't that, oh, all accounts will unlock after a certain period of time. That wasn't secure enough. So so time wasn't going to help us in that particular case. But, in this, the other downside is, doing it during, after hours. If it is an issue that, you can kind of rectify after a certain amount of time, then it's, you can certainly have time if you do that security testing in the after hours. So the functional testing, I mentioned that, the spray and pray, the limited deployment, and the test environment with manual testing. So you do your security testing. That first part is what helps you identify what issues you need to actually make within your environment. And then when you're about to make those changes to your production environment, so say you need to upgrade like the version of encryption that you're using, or you need to apply a certain patch. You all have probably seen the pop-ups on your phone, right, or your computer that's like, hey, there's a security update that needs to be made, right? So very similar in like fashion, organizations also get those pop-ups for their environments, for the software and the operating systems and the firmware that they have installed in their environments, and there's a need to make that kind of change. And so depending upon the organization's processes around change management, they either have that, hey, you can just go ahead and push and you don't have to test beforehand, or they might have that limited deployment as their process, or they could have like a separate test environment where they can do some of the testing. So in terms of just some of the best practices in how organizations should approach the changes, is one, it's to, of course, identify the gaps first. So it's imperative that organizations are actually taking the time and on a regular basis. Industry standard is typically about 30 days to do your vulnerability and configuration or compliance scans on that kind of cadence. Some organizations wait until quarterly, but really the better practice is to have something where you're looking at it at least in a 30-day cycle. So understanding what those issues are. You'd be surprised how many organizations just don't even do any sort of scan or determination of what the issues could be, right? Being proactive about that. So that's certainly the first step, is to understand what the gaps might be. And these gaps, some of them certainly are like patch related, but other ones, as I mentioned, when you think of like configuration settings, some of that is driven by the industry that you're in and the type of data that you have on your system, right? Like, so if you have federal government data on your system, controlled unclassified information, there's certain security settings and requirements associated with protecting that data on your system. If you have health data, especially if you have it at a certain threshold, there's certain configuration settings and the like that would be required in order to appropriately protect that data on your system. Same with financial data, et cetera. So some of that, the security issues aren't just related to patches and new viruses that might have been released, but they are related to actual configuration settings to properly protect the data on your systems. So one is you got to identify what your issues are. The second part is to actually test the patch or the configuration change. So sometimes cybersecurity is reduced. I did talk a couple of days ago where I was talking about cybersecurity is not just about confidentiality, right? Like sometimes like we can think that, cybersecurity is just about making sure only the right people have access to the data. Cybersecurity is also about, and this is the CIA triad, not Central Intelligence Agency, but confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Cybersecurity encompasses all of those. So it's not just the confidentiality, but it's the integrity, making sure that the data is accurate and it's reliable and someone doesn't have access to change it in ways that would render it inaccurate. Because when you make decisions on inaccurate data, just think about all the decisions that get made based upon like data every day. This this is a small thing, but like weather, right? Like I'm like, okay, if the weather's like this, I'm not wearing my hair like that, right? Like, but that's a small decision. But think about like benefits decisions that are made about you, right? Like if your information, or health decisions that are made about you. If the data is inaccurate, that's a problem because, you know, maybe it's a wrong diagnosis, or maybe it's a wrong prescription that's given. So, and the other part of that is availability. Is the data accessible to those that it should be accessible to? So when you start talking about testing and why testing is important, you have to think about that availability factor. If there is a functional impact, an adverse functional impact, to making a security update. Yes, it's a great idea to make that security update, but understand that availability is also a security concern, right? Like if you do something that renders that system unavailable, that data unavailable to whom it should be available to, you have created a new security issue, right? Like that's why it's so imperative to understand the functional impact of making a security update. You don't want to end up doing something for security reasons, right, to be more secure, and then create a new security problem. Right? So that's why this testing is so important. And the test should really be done in a non-production environment, right? And the reason for that is some of that we've already discussed. Things can break, right? Like there can be an adverse impact to making those changes. And it's really difficult to understand what that adverse impact would be, or combination of actions that make that adverse impact appear, if you don't actually have a robust approach to doing your functional testing prior to deploying to a production environment. And then after that, of course, it's to actually deploy your updates, right? And so there's a lot of tools available for automating the deployment of those updates or changes. So you have tools like BigFix or SolarWinds or Intune. These are all examples of tools that use automation to deploy. So what you'll find in the industry right now is that there's a lot of automation on the part of identifying the issues. A lot of different scan tools like Tenable, Nessus, Qualys is a scanner. You have open source ones like Volmap. You have Tanium. So there's a lot of tools that will help you identify what those gaps are. You also have a lot of tools that assist with using automation to deploy broad changes to thousands of devices, right? Like, so you're not like actually having to go device by device in an organization and make the updates. You actually have a lot of tools that will give you that automation for deploying. Where there's quite a bit of a gap is around automation in testing, right? Those impacts. Like it's you find out the issue, you can deploy the issue, but automation around testing is where there needs to be quite a bit of work, and that's actually where I've created like innovation there. It's the hard problem. It's not the fun, sexy threat hunting stuff, right? But it's where there is a lack in the industry. And just based upon working with customers and clients and 20 years in the industry, like, unfortunately, if you look at even our own federal government, like, they get like OIG audits and they have those published, a lot of times what you're looking at, like on the web, when you look at those reports is like, why are there so many issues that are still open after so long? And really it's because you're balancing mission and security. And it's an unfortunate toss-up. So it's really critical to try to get a quick answer to the question, if we make this security update, what will the functional impact be? That way you put organizations in the driver's seat to make a risk-based decision about whether, when, and how to make their updates. So in terms of resources that are really helpful for addressing vulnerability patch change management, one of them is with NIST, the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, the NCCOE. So they have published a practice guide that talks about improving enterprise patching to general IT systems and utilizing existing tools, et cetera, in better ways. And so in here you will also find recommendations about how you can better streamline your process and your approach and tools that you can use, potentially like using scripts, et cetera, to do some of the automation, both in identifying the issues as well as testing the issues and deploying the issues. So that's a really great resource. And the thing about NIST publication is they work with, they get industry input, so it's not just, you know, some top-heavy kind of government input on how to approach things. There's a lot of collaboration intentionally with industry, and so specifically industry is in mind with the NCCOE as they're coming up with issues. So they're identifying and getting feedback on what are some of the prevalent issues that industry is experiencing in different areas, and then they work with different industry companies and vendors to create a almost like a model of what could work or what kind of solution could be put into place. So they stay vendor agnostic, but they just give like a representative kind of build of what it could look like to have that sort of solution in your environment. Another one is with Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. So DHS is the security standard for the government. I say that with a bit of tongue-in-cheek because sometimes they have their own security issues, but from a role perspective, DHS is supposed to be the poster child for cyber for the government, and then DHS is also position to provide standards and tools for critical infrastructure entities in the U.S. So there's 18 critical infrastructure key resource sectors. You can see those if you search for, you know, CIKR, critical infrastructure key resource sectors. But those sectors are, you know, health, their finance. They are federal government, information technology, critical manufacturing. Those are just some examples. But when you think of the sectors that are core to our way of life, and if those are impacted adversely in some way, how that would have a crippling effect across the U.S. and our way of life. And increasingly, it's not just the military in government that our adversaries, you know, U.S. adversaries are interested in. It's the American way of life. And so there's a focus on critical infrastructure sectors and attacking those and crippling those. And so a lot of these tools that are developed and provided are ones that can help organizations that are within those sectors. Another one is tools with the Center for Internet Security, and you all will get a chance to hear from Tony Sager in the back. He didn't expect my call out, but he is an evangelist and a key player with CIS and has been for a number of years. So if you go to their website, they have several security benchmarks for numerous technologies. So if you're looking for security configuration, best practices and settings for different Windows operating system versions or Google Cloud type of product, or a Linux operating system, or a browser like Chrome, how you should configure that and what settings are best. That's where CIS is very helpful. Another one is with my venture SciDeploy. We currently have a free community-based version, so you can take a digital twin of your system and you can test out. We have the ability for you to do a vulnerability, a configuration scan, etc., on your environment, the digital twin that's taken of your system, and you can see what the issues are and kind of test out the functional impact of making those changes. So certainly love to have students like poking in, and we have like our paid pilots going now, and I know students be like, that doesn't work right and that doesn't. We want that. You guys are the early adapters in crossing the chasm context. We are looking for individuals and organizations that are the early adopters that want to poke and pry and, you know, give us the feedback on what could be better from a user experience or just functionality. So certainly feel free to take advantage of these tools. All right, so that's me and some of my team. We're having so much fun, right? I was like, everybody smile, you know, but yeah, we do have fun as a team, but that's my contact information. Thank you so much, certainly for your time. I'd like to take some questions at this point.